Hi, everyone. So in today's lecture, we're going to be looking at water pollution, particularly types of water pollution and their sources. Water pollution is any physical, biological, or chemical change in water quality that adversely affects living organisms or makes water unsuitable for desired uses. Basically, it's anything that can contaminate water to make it unsuitable for both our use as humans and other aquatic uses, or other uses by aquatic organisms. Now, we can define or categorize water pollution in a number of different ways. And one ways we can categorize water pollution is by how it is discharged. And within that, we can have point source or non-point source. Now, point source is probably what you're already thinking, right? This is where a pollutant is discharged from a specific location, such as a sewer outfall, industrial effluent pipe, or a ditch. Now, because point sources are readily identifiable, right? You can all see that pipe right there. They are easier to monitor and regulate than non-point source water pollution. Non-point source water pollution has no specific discharge location. This is something such as runoff that you may see from farms or pastures or golf courses or parking lots, etc. after a rain, right? There's no specific location that pollution is discharging from. It's from that entire farm field or that entire roadway. That makes it harder to identify. It's not only that it's harder to identify in that sense that makes it harder to monitor and regulate, but non-point source pollution is also highly episodic or variable, right? It's not occurring regularly, right? Especially if we're talking about runoff, that's what's going to dictate those pollutants are the amount of cars if we're talking about, or if you just fertilize, as well as rainfall. So it's more episodic, it's more variable, it's harder to identify, and thus it's harder to monitor and regulate. We can also categorize water pollution by the waters that it affects. And we have three main categories within this group. Water pollution can impact groundwater, it can impact surface water, and it can impact a subset of surface water, which is our oceans. Now, groundwater is the water found beneath the Earth's surface, right? It makes up about 40% of our drinking water in the United States. Once polluted, groundwater can be polluted for decades or even thousands of years. And that pollution can then seep into streams or lakes or rivers, as you see over here where the topography dips down, right? There's that interacting, where's my thing? There's that interaction here between groundwater and surface water. And if we add pollution in our groundwater, it can then flow and impact our surface water. Our surface water is our water on the surface of the earth, right? It's our oceans, streams, lakes, rivers. Now, often we're talking about freshwater surface water because kind of ocean water has its own category. But our freshwater surface water accounts for the other proportion of our drinking water, right? Groundwater is 40%, surface water is 60%. And a concern is that a 2022 report by the Environmental Integrity, or it's an environmental integrity report. They're a nonprofit that was founded by members or old members of the EPA. It found that half of our rivers and lakes and a quarter of our estuary miles are impaired. And by impaired, they meant that they are not fit for either swimming or aquatic life, fishing, or drinking. That's a large amount of our water bodies that are impaired. And if we focus just on New Jersey, that same study found that 95% of New Jersey rivers and streams were impaired, right? Not good news. Now, besides, like I said, we can look at a subset of surface water, and that is our ocean water. And that's our third way that we can categorize our water pollution if we're looking at this metric. Now, ocean water, you're probably all familiar with what oceans are, right? 80% of our marine pollution originates on land, right? And that is coming from runoff or marine debris, particularly trash and microplastics that we're going to talk about at the end of this lecture. So we can look at discharge, right? Point source for non-point source. We can look at what water body is being infected or what class of water, groundwater, surface water, or ocean water. And we can also break down water pollution by type and source. And that's what we're going to do for the rest of this lecture. And if you could see here, it can get complicated, right? Because there are multiple types of water pollution. And often there can be multiple sources for that particular type, right? There could be multiple sources for nutrient pollution that we're going to look at, multiple sources for pathogens. And the sources themselves can contribute multiple different types of pollution, right? Agricultural runoff can contribute sediment, nutrients, pathogens, herbicides and pesticides, etc. So there is a bit of a web that you can see here, right? And it can get a bit complicated. But what we're going to do is really focus on some of these main types and look at their sources. And in later lectures, we'll look at how we address this water pollution. So I'm going to start with sediment. And it may not be what you initially think of when you think of water pollution. But sediment pollution is, in fact, the most common water pollutant in the United States. Now, sediment is essentially soil particles, sand, silt, or clay, that get washed or deposited into water bodies. And this occurs through natural process. Erosion is a natural process, right, where wind and water and waves kind of dislodge these soil particles, right, and they end up in our water bodies. But human activities can greatly exacerbate erosion. And we see this with agricultural practices that are tilling the soil or not utilizing cover crops. We see this with construction, which is a major source of our sediment pollution, right? We're disturbing the soil. That makes it easier for runoff. But we can also see it in how we manage stormwater, right? And how we develop. Improper management of stormwater, increasing development will lead to these higher flows of water during rainfall events that will exacerbate erosion in areas. Now, sediment pollution is a problem because it can have a number of effects, right? And I have some of them listed there. It impacts benthic habitat, which is important for aquatic insects, which serve as food sources for a whole bunch of other organisms in our streams. It impacts fish and their spawning, can increase their mortality. It impacts submerged aquatic vegetation. On the other side of the state, on the coast over here, in Barnegat Bay, used to have acres and acres of submerged aquatic vegetation. Well, it is just submerged aquatic vegetation is just rooted vegetation under the water. It's just like your plants that you will find on land, and they need access to light. Well, with more sediment that flows into that water body, it creates turbidity that blocks out that light, and it leads to the death of these plants. It can also impact corals in our marine environments, alter water flows, reduce depths of water bodies leading to community flooding, and it can add nutrients to our water body. And nutrient pollution is a big issue. Now, when we're talking about nutrient pollution, we are focusing particularly on two nutrients, right? When we're talking about it in regards to water bodies and water pollution. Those two nutrients are nitrogen and phosphorus. So when you have an excess of nutrients, and we refer to this as eutrophication, it allows for the growth and the great proliferation of algae and phytoplankton. Now this becomes a problem, not for when they are growing in and of itself. What happens is if you have this abundant growth of algae or phytoplankton or both, it can both block out that submerged aquatic vegetation leading to their death. And this submerged aquatic vegetation, they're just like plants, they're producing oxygen. So that's going to decrease an oxygen source in our water. But that algae is eventually going to die. And when it dies, there are bacteria and other organisms that begin breaking it down. And as they break it down, they are consuming energy. And to consume that energy, they need oxygen. So they're also consuming oxygen. So what happens is you have this abundant growth of algae. Eventually, it's starting to die. It starts to get consumed or broken down by bacteria. That bacteria consumes oxygen, and it sucks up or uses up all the dissolved oxygen that is in the water. And as a result, those dissolved oxygen levels decrease, and you could see the death of other aquatic organisms such as fish. And you will see this with eutrophic lakes or water bodies all around. Right? I grew up. I saw this. My uncle lived on a lake, and it was eutrophic, and we saw this all the time. And you will see these large-scale fish kills. They'll often occur in the summertime, and they will occur at night, right, when there's no longer photosynthesis occurring, and in hot days, right, and it'll decrease that dissolved oxygen, lead to these fish kills. But this doesn't just occur in freshwater environments. It'll also occur in coastal areas and marine environments across the world. So you can see all those red dots are low oxygen zones or dead zones, right? Some of them are dead zones. And these are areas that, due to this eutrophication and this increase of nutrients, we are seeing the breakdown, or like the growth of the algae, growth of phytoplankton, its eventual breakdown, and the lowering of oxygen levels, so much so that nothing else can live in that area. You're probably familiar, the most at least widely known one, or at least familiar in the United States, is at the mouth of the Mississippi River, right, in Louisiana, where it flows into the Gulf of Mexico, and there's a huge dead zone there that is the result of all the nutrients that are flowing into the Mississippi River as it drains down through a large portion of America. It's that same process. So nutrients, particular issue when we are related to water bodies and water pollution. So what are the sources of our nutrient pollution? Right, I already kind of mentioned it when I talked about sediment. And that sediment can come from our regular stormwater runoff coming from fertilized gardens or lawns, or sediment coming from agricultural fields. But it's also excess fertilizer that gets applied to these places as well. So fertilizer that gets applied to your lawn, or to your garden, or to golf courses, or to our agricultural fields that isn't taken up by our plants in the amounts that are applied and flows into our water bodies. Animal waste, right? Farm animal poop is a huge issue. It's going to contain nutrients that can flow into our water, right? Can lead to eutrophication, as well as human waste, right? Our human sewage, our human poop, and our other wastewater will contain nutrients that can impact these water bodies. And we'll talk about sewage and wastewater in a little bit, right? Even with our modern wastewater treatment, we say modern, but some of it is dated. There are always issues with infrastructure as it gets older, right? There are leaks, there are sewer line leaks, etc. There could be, if you have a septic system, there could be problems with your septic system. These are all potential sources of human sewage and wastewater that can find its ways into our surface water or our groundwater. Now, I just talked about sewage, and that's important because sewage or animal waste is an important source of another type of water pollutant, and those are fecal pathogens. So fecal pathogens are disease-causing organisms found in the gastrointestinal tract of warm-blooded animals, and they are spread through contact with their poop, right, or their waste. There could be a number of health effects that are from more mild, such as rashes or stomach aches or diarrhea, to more severe things like typhoid or cholera, meningitis, hepatitis, etc. Now, there are numerous viruses, bacteria, and protozoans that can cause disease that are found in poop. And when we are testing for them, we don't test, at least we're testing a water body, we don't test for all of them, right? Because there's so many of them. Instead, we use what are called indicator species. And in this case, we use coliform bacteria primarily. Now, coliform bacteria is always present in the digestive tract and waste of animals. So if we test a water sample or a water body and we detect coliform bacteria, we can be pretty sure that there is also waste in that water body, right? Because our coliform is always found in animal waste. And again, if there's waste, we could assume that there could be these other viruses or pathogens that could also be in that water body that could impact human health. Now, besides just coliform bacteria, we also sometimes test for E. coli, excuse me, and enterococci as well. They're also used as indicators. The same idea, right? In that case, E. coli could be a pathogen, and enterococci, I think, are pathogens as well. But if they're present, it means that there is poop present in the water, and there could be other viruses and bacteria and protozoans that could be in that water as well that can impact human health. Now, what are the sources of this poop, right? We already mentioned some of these, right? Animal waste or farm animal waste. It's estimated that about 5 billion tons of poo will be produced by farm animals, mostly livestock, by 2030. That's a significant amount of poop, and it's a lot of poop that needs to be managed properly to avoid issues with water pollution. And it's not just your farm animals, but our pets. A 2017 study by the University of Minnesota found pet waste was the leading source of phosphorus in the Mississippi River watersheds around St. Paul, Minnesota. Right? So this is essentially people not picking up after their dogs, which drives me crazy. And it's the dog poop that is essentially making its way or flowing ultimately into water bodies. And in this case, it's the leading source of phosphorus, right? And again, that phosphorus is one of those limiting nutrients that when it's in excess will lead to that eutrophication and all those ramifications. So we can have farm animal waste, dog poop, right? But also human waste and human sewage. Now, globally, about half of the Earth's population lacks access to safely managed sanitation. But it's not just developing countries that have to worry about sewage and wastewater in their water bodies. Even in places with wastewater treatment plants, those plants are often dated, as I talked about, and they're incapable of removing a multitude of wastewater pollutants. Right? They're often pretty good at diseases and the fecal pathogens, but they are not good at removing excess nitrogen or phosphorus, which we talked about just before. And they're also not good at removing hormones and pharmaceuticals, which brings us to our next pollutant of concern, pharmaceuticals and other organic compounds found in wastewater. Right, as I just mentioned, even the most modern and efficient wastewater treatment plants aren't completely capable of degrading these compounds before they end up in rivers and lakes. Right, and there was a large global study that was done recently and sampled 1,000 sampling sites in all countries on all continents, and they found a number of pharmaceuticals in these water bodies, our lakes, our streams, and our rivers. Right, the two common, most frequently detected pharmaceuticals were a drug that's used to treat epilepsy and nerve pain, and one that's used to treat type 2 diabetes. But they also found high concentrations of caffeine and nicotine and painkillers in these water samples as well. Now, this is of concern, and part of it's of concern because we still don't know the impact that pharmaceuticals will have on the environment. We do know that there have been some small studies that have been done, or some studies that have been done that looked at birth control pills, and they are having an effect on different fish species and fish populations. So, or contraceptives and their effect. So there will likely be an effect of this increase in pharmaceuticals in our wastewater. We are still studying it to figure out what that will be. But it's not just pharmaceuticals, right? In the US, a USGS survey found that in wastewater, there were a whole host of other compounds, from steroids to insect repellent to disinfectants, antibiotics, hormones, etc. Right? So all of these can be found in our wastewater, and this is after treatment, and this is wastewater that's being dumped directly into our streams and our rivers. We also need to be aware and concerned with herbicides and pesticides. About 500,000, almost 500,000 metric tons of pesticides are used in the United States each year, and much of it washes into our waterways through runoff. And it could have dramatic ramifications. Probably the most well-known is DDT in the 1960s, right? DDT was used as an effective pesticide. It was super effective as a pesticide, but it had ramifications. It bioaccumulated in fish. Those fish were eaten by birds, such as bald eagles, and that affected their eggshell strength. And ultimately, it made the eggshells weaker. They were crushing, and bald eagles weren't able to reproduce effectively, and it led to a drastic decline in bald eagle populations. They were put on the endangered species list. You're probably aware of this story, right? And we stopped using DDT. Well, there are other pesticides that are still being used and are still flowing into our water system, and that we know are accumulating and can have effects on different populations. So we're seeing other pesticides starting to accumulate, and there will likely be more stories such as that DDT story. Besides pesticides, herbicides are also frequently applied both in an agricultural setting and in a residential setting. Glyphosate, which is known as the commercial name Roundup, is the most widely used herbicide in the world. And in a nationwide USGS study, it was found or detected in 90% of stream samples. So it's basically ubiquitous in streams around the United States. And these are the sampling locations right there. You can find traces of Roundup or its derivatives. The second most widely used herbicide, atrazine, can also be found nationwide, and it's estimated that there are around 600,000 kilograms of it in the Great Lakes, which is an insane amount. And we know atrazine has negative effects on populations. It's been shown to disrupt development of frogs in very, very low concentrations, 0.1 parts per billion, and that's common in our farming regions, right? So herbicides and pesticides are being applied en masse in agricultural areas and residential settings, and they're making their way into their water bodies, and they have had effects, and they could have future effects that are quite detrimental. Hydrocarbons, right? Another pollutant to be concerned with, right? And when I say hydrocarbons, I'm talking about oil and its derivatives: gasoline, fuel oil, motor oil, jet fuel, etc. Now, if you are thinking about, perhaps if you're thinking about water pollution, maybe oil was the first thing that came to your mind, and that's probably related to oil spills, right? And there have been numerous large-scale oil spills or large-scale disasters that resulted in the release of oil throughout modern history. You can see some of them right here, right, affecting U.S. waters. The most recent one, or most recent large-scale one, I think it's the most recent one, is the Deepwater Horizon that happened in 2010. It's actually the third worst oil spill on record. It released over or around 134 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico, an extreme amount. But it's not just these large-scale disasters, right? They get a lot of press. They release a ton of oil. But it's really thousands of small oil spills that occur in U.S. waters each year that contribute the most to oil pollution in our waters, right? It's hard to get an exact number on how much oil goes into our water or hydrocarbon goes into our water. An older estimate was about 29 million gallons in the U.S. Your book said 644 million gallons globally, which is a huge amount. But regardless, around 85% of that, at least if we're looking at the United States, is coming, of that 29 million gallons, is coming from these small spills. And these are small spills or small leaks that occur in fuel and engine oil leaks that will occur in larger ships, but also smaller recreational boats, airplanes, jet skis, etc. Right? Also, little small ruptures in oil pipelines that can spill oil into surface waters, and runoff from roads and parking lots, etc. Right? All of that is contributing, and it's actually contributing more to oil pollution in our waters than these large-scale disasters, at least on a yearly basis. Now, there are a number of effects of oil pollution, kind of two main effects. The first is fouling, and this is often with these large-scale spills, right? Oil will physically harm. When we talk about fouling, it's the physical harm of an animal or a plant, right? For example, on that poor pelican that you see there, that oil is going to coat those feathers. It causes them to lose insulation, right? So they can lose body heat, leading to death. It's going to prevent that bird from flying, etc., also leading to death. Besides just that physical harm, referred to as fouling, we can also have toxicity and toxic effects, right? Oil is filled with toxic chemicals that can lead to death, developmental abnormalities, and sublethal effects in a number of aquatic species, from fish to sea turtles to oysters, crabs, etc. Right? And some of those are listed right there. Now, besides impacting our surface waters and our ocean waters, our hydrocarbons, our oil, can also impact our groundwater. If you go to any gas station, it's likely has an underground storage tank that is holding the gas. There's around 500,000 USTs, underground storage tanks, nationwide. And a recent study said that about 60% of all of them have experienced at least one leak. That is oil or gas that is leaking into the groundwater. And the costs of this are around $1 billion a year in state and federal funds. I used to work for an environmental consulting company half of my job was dealing with contamination at gas stations, right? For USTs where there are leaks, it leaks into the soil, it gets into the groundwater. If you're ever at a gas station, look for monitoring wells. There'll be a label on them. Those wells are designed to monitor the pollution that is leaked from that UST into the groundwater to both monitor the extent of it and hopefully see as it degrades. Now we also need to be concerned about metals in our water. Number of different types of metals: aluminum, chromium, cobalt, nickel, mercury, zinc, etc. Right? There's more than just those that I mentioned. A lot of the source of these metals come from mining, right? So the direct mining for them, as well as the processing of them, so the smelting and the foundries and etc. But metals can also come from, besides those industrial processes and the mining, can also get into our waters through stormwater runoff. Heavy metals are found in sewage. And we can also see metals that impact our water from atmospheric deposition, right? Think of way back in our air pollution lecture when I talked about mercury and how mercury gets released or emitted with the burning of coal and coal power plants, and that it bioaccumulates in our fish. And it's why we can't eat, we have to limit our fish intake because of mercury, right? Just like other metals, it becomes toxic in large amounts. We need to limit our mercury input, and that is directly related to burning of coal and this atmospheric deposition of mercury into our marine food web. Now, mining, like I said, will release metals, and mining will also release acids, right? Particularly coal mining. So the sulfur compounds in coal will react with oxygen and water to make sulfuric acid. And when that gets discharged or discharged into streams, it'll essentially destroy the life in those streams. This is very similar to the problem of acid rain, right? Coal mining is releasing the sulfur compounds. The burning of that coal is releasing the sulfur dioxide emissions that are interacting with water vapor, leading to an acid rain, decreasing the pH of our streams and rivers, and leading to the death of different populations of organisms. Besides just coal mining and acid rain for the burning of coal primarily, acids are also released as byproducts of industrial processes such as leather tanning, metal smelting, petroleum distillation, and different organic chemical synthesis. Now, another thing that I'd like to mention is thermal pollution. So this is a little bit different from, we were primarily looking at chemical pollution, right? We had sediment, pathogens, but a lot of those other ones were different chemicals. Thermal pollution is heat, right? So your power plants, metal smelters, a lot of different industries or industrial processing, they create a lot of heat, and they need to cool, they need to remove that heat from the industrial facility. And the easiest way to do that is to take in water, cool water from a nearby water body, be it an ocean, river, or lake, run it through a heat exchanger, extract that excess heat, and then return the heated water back to the original source. Now, what this does is it disrupts the natural ecosystem, so it'll drive away cold water species, attract warm water species. And that's not always the worst thing, but it can have some negative repercussions that maybe sometimes are unexpected, right? An example you could see in that background below, those are all manatees that are all basking in the warm waters that are coming out of that, I believe that's a power plant or some sort of industrial process. Why this can be a problem is it can impact the behavior of these organisms, right? So it's an unnaturally warm water that's coming out of there. It may cause them to congregate, like you see there. It may cause them to stay in this area when they really shouldn't be staying in this area. It's perhaps too far north. Those waters normally get much colder. And if there's any sort of interruption to that outflow of that water, we will lose that warm water. The organisms will get cold and they could die. And we've seen this with manatees where they've become trapped in these areas, these outflow areas at power plants. Something happens to the power plant, it needs to shut down for a week. And then the manatees go into cold shock and die when they lose that warm water. The last thing I want to talk about is litter and marine debris. So this is anything that you think of when you think of litter, right? Plastic bags, plastic bottles, balloons, buoys, derelict crab pots and fishing gear, fishing lines, styrofoam. Now, litter and marine debris is a big problem, particularly in our oceans, right? Marine, that's what we're talking about. Because it often leads to three things: entanglement, ingestion, and or suffocation. So our organisms can get entangled in this debris, impact their growth, impact their ability to swim. If it is enough entanglement, it can drag them down into the water if they can't get oxygen if they are mammals, or if they can't move well enough and get water flowing through their gills, it can lead to suffocation. And organisms also ingest debris. Sea turtles eat jellyfish. Jellyfish look a whole lot like a plastic bag that's floating in the water. Down there, it's small, but that is an albatross that's been cut open, and you can see all the plastic debris that is in its stomach, right? So that ingestion not only can lead to a false sense of satiation, so they think they're full, but they're not getting any nutrients, but it can block up their digestive system. They could be carrying pollutants, etc., that could lead to their death. Now, a majority of marine debris is plastic, about 80%. And it's been estimated that for every square mile of ocean, there are about 46,000 pieces of plastic, which is a crazy amount. Now, interestingly, 90% of all plastic that reaches the world's oceans comes from 10 rivers. So if we could just manage and better manage our waste coming from, on a global scale, coming from those rivers, we could drastically reduce pollution, or plastic pollution, that is impacting our oceans. Now, once it's in our oceans, our pollution, our plastic pollution, or marine debris can congregate or amass due to swirling ocean currents called gyres, and they can amass into these large garbage patches. You've probably heard of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's the largest of all of these, but there are multiple garbage patches. The Great Pacific one is estimated to be about 620,000 square miles in area, a huge area. It has been increasing. It's been increasing by tenfold each decade since 1945. And it may not be what you're thinking of, right? I often, when you first hear it, you think of like essentially a landfill floating in the water. But it's not really large scale or large areas or large pieces of debris. Most of the debris or garbage is fingernail sized or smaller. And it's actually hard to notice. You can't notice it from satellite video or photography because it's these small particles that are in this area, right? Like I said, fingernail size or even smaller, like microplastics. Microplastics are another source of pollution that are being studied recently, right? Just like with when we talked about pharmaceuticals, we're looking at the effects of pharmaceuticals. We're doing a lot of studies to figure it out. It's the same thing with microplastics. So these are pieces of plastic that are smaller than 5 millimeters, so very, very tiny pieces of plastic. Majority of them come from clothing, right? So microfibers that are found in clothing that get washed off, right, as you're washing your clothing, particularly synthetic clothing. But microbeads are found in toothpaste and cosmetics. They're also a significant source of microplastics. And they can also form from the breakdown of larger plastic sources like plastic bottles and bags and tires, etc. They're found on every environment across the earth. And like I said, we're still learning about their environmental effects. They're likely not going to be good. We do know that they can be incorporated into animal tissues and they can transfer pollutants through that action. And we have seen that they have been affecting filter feeders, particularly bivalves, right? So we're still learning about them, but they're likely going to have a negative impact or already having a negative impact. So that is it when it comes to water pollutants. Excuse me, the next lecture, we're going to look at some of the ways that we have addressed some of these pollutants and what we can do in the future to further address them and protect our waters and hopefully clean up our waters.